The wind was a blade against the exposed skin of his face. It howled down from the spire peaks, carrying the promise of a sterile, frozen death. Alaric stood at the base of the first true ascent, a lone, armored figure against a tapestry of jagged rock and bruised purple sky. To the world below, he was Stonefist, the unbreakable hunter, the bulwark against the things that crept in the dark. But here, alone with the mountain, he was just an old man running out of time. A tremor started deep in his chest, a familiar and hated rattling. It climbed his throat, forcing its way out in a series of racking coughs that bent him double. He braced a gauntleted hand against a lichen-scarred boulder, his breath coming in ragged, useless gasps. When the spasm passed, he spat onto the frozen ground. It wasn't just blood that stained the snow. Mixed within the crimson were fine, gray particles like granite dust. The gray consumption. A poet's name for a merciless disease that was grinding his insides to grit, turning living flesh to lifeless powder. The healer had given him 2 months, maybe less. That was 6 weeks ago. He lifted his gaze, his eyes burning with a cold fire that had long since replaced fear. High above, wreathed in churning clouds, the silhouette of Castle Malachor was a jagged tooth against the heavens, his final hunt, his only hope. His movements were stiff, each one a negotiation with aching joints and failing muscles. He conducted a final check of his gear, a ritual honed over 100 battles. The silver-headed axe, Wolf's Wail, hung heavy at his side, its polished surface gleaming with a hungry light. Across his back a heavy crossbow, its stock worn smooth by his grip. The quiver at his hip was filled with iron bolts, each one tipped with a core of blessed silver. Flasks of holy water clinked softly against his cuirass, a holy music amidst the profane silence. He patted a leather pouch filled with garlic bombs, their acrid scent a small comfort. But the most important tool was the one tucked inside his coat, a heavy leather-bound grimoire. He pulled it out, the cracked leather cold against his fingers. Decades of forbidden knowledge, purchased with blood and gold, were inked onto its yellowed pages. He flipped to a dog-eared section, his eyes tracing the spidery script of a long-dead sorcerer. The ritual of bloody rebirth. The words were a blasphemy, a perversion of life itself, but to Alaric they were a prayer, a promise. He closed the book and began to climb. The higher he went, the more the land itself seemed to sicken. The gnarled, wind-stunted pines gave way to skeletal trees, with bark like peeling bone. The very stones under his feet changed, taking on a slick, unhealthy sheen, covered in patches of a strange crimson moss that seemed to pulse with a faint internal light. It was near one of these patches that he found the cougar, or what was left of it. The great cat had been torn apart, its rib cage shattered and ripped open with a force no earthly predator could muster. Its spine was snapped in 3 places, the breaks as clean as if done by a giant's hands. Alaric knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a massive 3-toed footprint in the half-frozen mud beside the carcass. He was in their territory now, the castle's guardians. The memory of the healer's hut surfaced, unbidden. The scent of drying herbs, the low crackle of the hearth. The old woman's eyes, full of pity as she examined the dust he'd coughed into a cloth. "It's the consumption, Alaric," she had said, her voice a soft death knell. "The final stage. There is no cure. Your strength will fail. Your lungs will fill. You will crumble from within." She saw the look on his face, the utter lack of resignation, the chillingly calm fury that settled in his eyes. She thought it was the hero's resolve, the look of a man determined to go down fighting a great evil. She had no idea how right and how terribly wrong she was. He pushed the memory away and focused on the tracks. This was his true craft, the skill that had kept him alive far longer than brute strength ever could. The print was deep, suggesting a creature weighing upwards of 300 pounds. Not a wolf. Something that walked on 2 legs when it chose, but ran on 4. He scanned the surrounding terrain, his mind a cold calculator. He found more prints, noting the distance between them, the patterns in their path. A pack. At least 5, maybe 6. They were patrolling a perimeter, a wide circle roughly 2 miles in radius from the castle's visible spire. They weren't just animals, they were sentries, strategic. He was no longer just a hunter, he was an infiltrator. As dusk bled across the sky, turning the snow to shades of rose and violet, he found a shallow cave, little more than a fissure in the rock face. It would have to do. He rolled a heavy boulder to narrow the entrance, leaving only a sliver of an opening to watch through. He ate a strip of dried meat, the tasteless food doing little to quell the grinding emptiness in his gut. Then, as the last light died and the world was plunged into the absolute black of a moonless mountain night, the howling began. It was a sound that would have frozen the blood of a lesser man. It started as a low, mournful call, then rose in pitch and volume, a chorus of guttural, soul-shaking rage. It was not the call of a wild animal. It was too complex, too full of hate. It was the sound of intelligent fury, of ancient hunger given voice. It echoed off the peaks, seeming to come from all directions at once, a symphony of damnation composed for an audience of one. Alaric drew Wolf's wail, its silver edge a faint line of comfort in the dark. He crawled to the opening of his meager shelter and peered out. The howling stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying. He scanned the opposing ridge, his veteran eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then he saw them. 3, no, 4 dark silhouettes standing upright against the star-dusted sky. They were impossibly tall, their forms a grotesque fusion of man and beast, and they were all looking directly at him. The hunt had begun. Morning broke, cold and gray. The sentinels on the ridge were gone. Alaric did not deceive himself. They were not gone, merely unseen. Any other man would have pressed on, trying to outrun the inevitable pursuit. But Alaric was not any other man. He knew that to ascend further was to walk into a trap on their terms. The hunter does not flee. He chooses the killing ground. Instead of climbing, he descended. He backtracked a quarter mile, moving with a deliberate, energy-conserving gait to a narrow gorge he had noted the day before. It was a natural bottleneck, a chasm no more than 20 feet wide with sheer rock walls rising over 100 feet on either side. A perfect place to make a stand. A perfect place to die. He spent the next hour transforming the gorge into a death trap. From his pack, he produced spools of thin, wickedly sharp silver wire, stretching them knee-high between boulders. Any creature charging through would be hamstrung or worse. He used his axe to chip away at the frozen earth, digging a shallow pit which he filled with sharpened stakes carved from the deadwood of a skeletal pine. He coated their tips with a thick, acrid paste from a clay jar, a concentrated extract of wolfsbane. Finally, he positioned himself on a wide ledge 10 feet up the gorge wall, offering a clear field of fire. He cocked his crossbow, loaded a silver-tipped bolt, and waited. The silence lasted for nearly an hour. Then a flicker of movement at the mouth of the gorge. They came not with howls, but with a predatory silence. The first wave was a scouting party, 3 of them, moving in a loose triangular formation. They were faster than he had anticipated, their powerful legs eating up the ground in loping, unnatural strides. Their bodies were a horrific parody of man and wolf, covered in coarse gray and black fur with elongated snouts full of yellowed fangs. The lead creature, a black-furred brute, hit the first silver wire. It didn't scream. The wire simply vanished into its thigh, and the beast tumbled forward with a wet, tearing sound, its leg nearly severed. Before it could rise, a second werewolf, leaner and quicker, leaped over its fallen comrade, its yellow eyes fixed on Alaric's ledge. It landed squarely in the concealed pit. There was a sickening series of thuds and cracks as the wolfsbane-coated stakes did their work. The third scout skidded to a halt, snarling, its gaze darting between its fallen packmates and Alaric. It was intelligent enough to realize the direct approach was suicide. It gathered its powerful haunches to leap for the gorge wall, seeking to climb and flank him. It never got the chance. Alaric's crossbow bucked against his shoulder. The bolt hissed through the air and struck the creature squarely in its left eye, punching through bone and brain. It collapsed in a twitching heap. 3 down. Alaric didn't even permit himself a moment of satisfaction. That was too easy. That was a test. A probe. The real attack was yet to come. He was right. A low growl echoed from above him. He glanced up and saw them, the rest of the pack, silhouetted against the gray sky. They were not charging into his trap. They were moving along the rim of the gorge, their dark forms flowing over the rock with an unnerving grace. And with them, standing on a high precipice overlooking the entire scene, was a beast that dwarfed the others. It was massive, its fur the color of iron filings and old snow, its shoulders broad as a draft horse's. The Alpha. It wasn't howling or snarling. It was observing, directing its pack with subtle shifts of its head, with sharp, silent gestures of a clawed hand. Alaric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was facing not a pack of beasts, but a unit of soldiers. The battle began in earnest. 2 werewolves leaped from the canyon rim, landing on the gorge floor with ground-shaking impact. They charged him simultaneously. Alaric dropped his crossbow and drew Wolf's Wail. He met the first charge not with force but with a sidestep, letting the creature's momentum carry it past him. As it went by, he brought the silver axe around in a vicious arc, cleaving deep into its flank. It howled, a true sound of pain this time, and spun around, its claws scything through the air where his head had been a second before. The second beast was already upon him. He threw one of his garlic bombs. The glass sphere shattered against the creature's chest, releasing a cloud of pungent, vaporized allium. The werewolf shrieked, clawing at its face, its sensitive olfactory system overwhelmed by the chemical assault. It gave Alaric the opening he needed. A 2-handed swing of Wolf's Wail took the disoriented creature's head from its shoulders. He turned back to the first, but it was faster than he expected. A set of claws, each the size of a railroad spike, raked across his left forearm, shredding his leather bracer and tearing through the flesh beneath. A burning, venomous fire shot up his arm. The lycanthrope poison. In a healthy man, it was a death sentence. In him it felt like pouring gasoline on a fire, the gray consumption in his blood reacting to the new toxin with a surge of agonizing activity. Ignoring the searing pain, he drove the pommel of his axe into the creature's snout, shattering bone, then finished it with a brutal thrust of the silver blade into its heart. He was breathing in ragged, painful gulps now, the wound on his arm weeping blackish blood. Only the Alpha remained. It did not leap down. It took a running start and bounded across the 20-foot chasm, landing on his ledge with an almost delicate precision. Up close, it was a titan. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its ancient yellow eyes burning with cold, calculating intelligence. This was no mere beast. This was a warrior. The Duel was a whirlwind of silver and claw. The Alpha was stronger, faster, and had a longer reach. Alaric was a master of leverage and timing. He parried, dodged, and used the creature's own weight against it. The ledge was slick with blood, and more than once he nearly lost his footing. He was weakening, the poison and his disease sapping the last of his legendary stamina. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged fight. With a roar, the Alpha swatted his axe aside and lunged, its jaws gaping for a killing bite to his throat. Alaric didn't retreat. He ducked under the attack, driving his shoulder hard into the creature's midsection. It was like hitting a wall of muscle and fur, but it was enough to unbalance the beast on the narrow ledge. As the Alpha staggered back, its hind leg slipping over the edge, Alaric drew a long silver dagger from his boot. He plunged it deep into the Alpha's side. The flask of holy water attached to the hilt shattered on impact, its contents flooding the wound. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The Alpha screamed, a sound of pure agony as the blessed water and silver burned through its tainted flesh. It flailed, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the rock, but its balance was gone. With a final hate-filled glare at Alaric, it toppled backward and fell into the abyss, its scream echoing long after it vanished from sight. Alaric collapsed against the rock wall, his body screaming in protest. His arm was on fire, and every breath was a new torment. For a long moment he thought he would simply die there. But then he pushed himself up, his will a stronger thing than his failing body. He dragged himself to the edge of the ledge and looked out of the gorge, up the mountain path. There, closer than ever, he saw it. Castle Malachor, a crown of black spires against the oppressive gray sky, and leading to its gates, a single slender bridge of carved stone, spanning a chasm so deep its bottom was lost to shadow. He had won the battle. Now he had to cross the bridge. The wind on the bridge was a physical force, a malevolent entity that sought to tear him from the narrow stone path and cast him into the bottomless gulf below. The chasm was thousands of feet deep, a scar in the mountain's heart. The bridge itself was an ancient, masterful piece of engineering, but time and weather had taken their toll. Cracks spiderwebbed its surface, and entire sections of the guardrail had crumbled away into the void. At the far end, the colossal gates of Malachor awaited. But the path was not clear. Seated in the middle of the span, as still and gray as the stone he rested on, was the bridge warden. It was a troll. Not the slobbering, dim-witted brutes of fairy tales, but something far older, far more elemental. It was immense, easily 12 feet tall, even when sitting, its body a lumpy mass of muscle and rock-like hide. Patches of the same crimson moss he'd seen on the slopes grew on its shoulders and back. It leaned on a stone club the size of a coffin, and its craggy, brutish face was set in an expression of profound geological boredom. Its name was Grok. As Alaric took his first hesitant step onto the bridge, the troll's eyes, small and black like chips of obsidian, swiveled to fix on him. It did not rise. It did not roar. It spoke, its voice a low rumble like stones grinding together deep underground. "Turn back, little man." The words were crude, the language broken, but understandable. The master wants no guests. He wants only quiet. This was unexpected. Alaric had prepared for a fight, not a conversation. He kept his hand near Wolf's wail, his body tense. This was another test, a different kind. "I have business with your master," Alaric called out over the wind. "I come in peace, to seek his counsel." The troll's massive head tilted. A sound like a minor rock slide rumbled in its chest, a dry, humorless chuckle. "You smell of lies, hunter, and silver, and holy fire." Its gaze seemed to penetrate Alaric's armor, his very skin. "You smell of death. Not just the one you carry in your hand, but the one that carries you." The blood drained from Alaric's face. The beast could smell his disease. It could sense the gray consumption grinding away at his bones. The psychological blow was more staggering than any physical strike. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade of the righteous hero faltered. "My business is my own," Alaric snarled, his voice harsher than he intended. He took another step forward. "The master's quiet is his own," Grok rumbled, and with a groan of stressed stone, the troll began to rise. It unfolded itself to its full, terrifying height, blocking the entire width of the bridge. "You will not pass." Negotiations were over. The fight began on the worst possible ground. The narrow bridge offered no room to maneuver, no space to dodge. Alaric was forced into a direct confrontation with a creature of unbelievable strength. The first swing of Grok's club missed him by inches, but the impact on the bridge sent a shockwave through the stone that nearly threw him off his feet. Chips of rock sprayed into the abyss. Alaric was a fly buzzing around a bull. His silver axe glanced off the troll's stony hide, leaving little more than a scratch. A crossbow bolt thudded into its shoulder and simply snapped, the silver tip failing to penetrate. Grok was slow, but each of its movements was an earthquake. A backhanded swipe of its massive fist forced Alaric to leap backward, his heels skidding precariously close to the edge. He was outmatched in strength. He had to rely on his wits, on the tools the troll couldn't comprehend. As Grok raised its club for another crushing blow, Alaric reached into his pouch and hurled a small, sealed glass vial. It flew in a perfect arc and shattered against the troll's face. The vial contained alchemist's fire. The effect was devastating. The sticky, volatile liquid burst into brilliant green flames, clinging to the troll's face and engulfing its head. Grok let out a roar of pure, unadulterated agony that shook the very mountain. It dropped its club, its massive hands flying to its face, trying to claw away the fire that was melting its tough hide and boiling its eyes in their sockets. Blinded and in torment, the troll began to flail wildly, a hurricane of destructive rage. It began to smash its fists blindly against the bridge. The ancient stone, already weakened, cracked and groaned under the titanic assault. Alaric saw a fissure race across the bridge between him and the troll. The entire structure was coming apart. In its mindless fury, Grok brought both fists down in a final cataclysmic blow right in front of its own feet. The section of the bridge it stood on gave way with a deafening crack. For a surreal moment, the great troll hung in the air, its burning face a mask of shock and pain. Then, with the debris of the bridge it had guarded for centuries, it plummeted into the blackness, its final roar swallowed by the immense, hungry silence of the chasm. The section of the bridge on Alaric's side was also collapsing. He didn't hesitate. As the stone beneath his feet tilted toward the void, he ran, his wounded body screaming in protest. He ran for the far side, for the gate of the castle. The last 10 feet of the bridge crumbled away before he could cross. With a desperate, guttural yell, he leaped. His fingers, raw and bleeding, scraped against the stone ledge before the gate, catching hold. His body slammed against the cliff face, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a heart-stopping moment, He dangled over the abyss, his entire existence held by the strength of his grip. Slowly, painfully, he hauled himself up. He collapsed onto the ledge, gasping, his body a symphony of pain. He was battered, poisoned, and utterly exhausted, but he was alive. He was at the gates. As he lay there, trying to will his heart to stop hammering against his ribs, he heard a sound. A soft, grinding noise deep within the mechanism of the castle gate. Without a sound, the massive iron-bound doors swung inward, opening into the darkness beyond. An invitation. Beyond the gate, Alaric expected a grim, cobblestoned courtyard, perhaps littered with bones or guarded by gargoyles. Instead, he stepped into a scene of impossible, haunting beauty. He found himself in a vast, open-air garden, cradled within the castle's high walls. There was no roof, only the star-dusted, night-black sky, dominated by a full moon that hung like a drop of blood, casting the entire space in a soft crimson light. This was no ordinary garden. Flowers of shapes and colors he had never seen grew in abundance, their petals glowing with a soft internal luminescence. Pale, ghost-white lilies, deep violet bell-shaped flowers, and blossoms of shimmering silver all pulsed with a gentle light, illuminating winding gravel paths and ornate stone benches. In the center of the garden, a fountain murmured, its water catching the bloody moonlight and sparkling as if filled with crushed rubies. The air was thick with a sweet, intoxicating perfume, a blend of night-blooming jasmine and something else, something richer and more exotic. He stumbled toward the fountain, his throat a desert. The poison from the werewolf's claw was a fever in his blood, and the exertion of the last few hours had left him dangerously dehydrated. He cupped his hands and drank from the fountain. The water was cool, impossibly pure. As it coursed through him, a wave of relief washed over his weary body. The burning in his arm subsided to a dull ache. The violent cough that had been building in his chest eased. For a fleeting, wonderful moment, he felt well. He drank again, deeply, feeling strength return to his limbs. This place was a sanctuary, a haven of peace in the heart of a monstrous domain. He sat on the edge of the fountain for a long while, letting the deceptive tranquility of the garden seep into him. But the instincts of a lifetime could not be so easily silenced. The hunter within him began to stir, noticing things the weary man had overlooked. The silence, for one. There were no insects chirping, no night birds calling. For a place so lush, it was unnervingly quiet. His gaze fell to the base of a cluster of glowing bell-shaped flowers. The soil around their roots was unnaturally dark, almost black and damp, despite the dry, cold mountain air. Curiosity overriding his exhaustion, he knelt down. He pushed aside the top layer of rich loam. Beneath it, the soil was a thick, coppery-smelling sludge, and embedded within it was a network of thin, white tubes branching out like veins. He followed one with his finger. It was hard and porous. He snapped a piece off and held it up to the crimson moonlight. It wasn't a root. It was bone. A cold dread began to coil in his stomach. The garden wasn't growing in the soil. It was being fed by it. This entire place was a single, living, parasitic organism. His eyes darted around the garden, seeing it now with a hunter's clarity. He saw the elegant statues placed artfully amongst the flora, a knight in full plate armor, sword held high, a wizard with a staff, his face turned to the sky, a young woman in a flowing gown. They looked like masterpieces of sculpture. He approached the nearest one, the knight. He ran a hand over the stone. It was smooth, but with a strange, organic texture. He looked closer at the face, visible within the raised visor. The knight's eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent, eternal scream of pure terror. They weren't statues, they were bodies, victims, drained of every drop of fluid, their desiccated forms coated in a thick, hardened layer of pollen that gave them a stone-like appearance. The sweet perfume in the air suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. It wasn't just a scent. It was the pollen, a soporific agent, designed to lull visitors into a peaceful slumber from which they would never awaken. He could already feel a lightheadedness, a pleasant lethargy creeping into his limbs. The healing water from the fountain was part of the trap, a mild sedative to calm the prey. He clamped a hand over his mouth and nose, trying not to breathe, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get out. He scanned the perimeter of the garden and saw it. On the far side, a massive arched door of dark oak, leading deeper into the castle. He began to move, his steps clumsy with the drug's effects. The garden, which had seemed so peaceful moments before, now felt menacingly alive. He imagined roots stirring beneath the ground, flowers turning their heads to watch him pass. He had to weave his way through a thicket of the large, silver-blossomed plants. As he pushed past one, a thick, vine-like tendril, covered in fine, silvery hairs, brushed against his boot. He heard a sizzle. He looked down and saw smoke rising from the leather. The point of contact was blackened and corroded, eaten away as if by a powerful acid. Panic gave him a jolt of adrenaline. He broke into a run, stumbling through the glowing, predatory flora, his lungs burning from holding his breath. The flowers seemed to reach for him now, their tendrils lashing out, their sweet scent a suffocating cloud around him. He slammed into the oak door, his hands fumbling for a latch or handle. It had none. He pushed, and with a low groan, the heavy door swung inward. He threw himself through the opening, landing hard on a cold stone floor, and kicked the door shut behind him. He lay there in the utter darkness, gasping for clean, untainted air. Behind the door, he could hear a soft, rustling sound, like 1,000 disappointed sighs. The garden was silent once more, patiently waiting for its next meal. The darkness inside was absolute, a stark contrast to the garden's ethereal glow. Alaric lay on the floor, his senses on high alert. The silence here was different from the garden's predatory stillness. This was the deep, undisturbed silence of the tomb. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of centuries and thick with a fine, granular dust that tickled his throat. He pushed himself to his feet and retrieved a small tinderbox from his pack. A flick of flint on steel and a tiny flame sprang to life, pushing back the oppressive dark. He lit a stubby tallow candle, and its flickering light revealed his surroundings. He was in a library. It was a cathedral dedicated to knowledge. Immense shelves carved from some dark, unidentifiable wood soared upwards for 50, maybe 60 feet, disappearing into the darkness above. Tens of thousands of books, bound in leather and iron and even stranger materials, stood in silent rows, their spines forming a mosaic of forgotten lore. A thick blanket of gray dust covered everything: the shelves, the floors, the heavy reading tables, and the high-backed chairs. Nothing had been disturbed here for a very long time. As he moved deeper into the cavernous room, the candlelight glinted off polished steel. Positioned like sentinels at the ends of the towering aisles were suits of full-plate armor, each standing in a formal at-ease pose, holding a halberd or a greatsword. They were relics from a forgotten age, their surfaces intricately engraved but now obscured by layers of dust. He walked past the first suit, his eyes scanning the book titles. The languages were alien to him, the alphabets twisted and arcane. As he passed the second suit of armor, he heard a faint sound behind him, a soft, dry scrape of metal on stone. He froze, candle held high. He turned slowly. The first suit of armor was no longer in its original pose. Its head, a visored helm, had turned to follow him. The empty eye slit seemed to stare directly at him. Before he could react, the second suit of armor moved, not with the clanking awkwardness of a machine, but with a silent, fluid grace. It raised its massive greatsword, the weapon humming faintly in the still air. These were not mere skeletons in armor. They were something else. Constructs animated by magic, their joints moving with an unnatural smoothness. Alaric dropped his candle, plunging the immediate area into darkness, and drew Wolf's Wail. The faint moonlight filtering through a high, grime-caked window was just enough to see the two metal giants advancing on him. He knew from his grimoire that silver was useless against this kind of enchantment. This was a battle of brute force and magical engineering. From his back, he unslung the one tool he had hoped not to need, a heavy, brutish warhammer with a blunted, rune-etched head. The first construct swung its halberd in a wide, sweeping arc meant to cut him in half. Alaric ducked under the blow, the weapon shearing through the air with a hungry whistle. He drove his hammer into the construct's knee joint. The impact was deafening, a clang that echoed through the vast library. The enchanted metal dented, and the construct's leg buckled. The second one was on him, its greatsword descending in a crushing overhead blow. He rolled aside as the sword slammed into the stone floor, sending up a shower of sparks and dust. He saw it then, a faint, pulsing blue rune, glowing on the back of the construct's skull, visible through the gap between helmet and gorget. That was the core, the magical heart. The battle became a deadly dance. He used the towering bookshelves as cover, darting between them, forcing the slow-moving but relentless constructs to navigate the narrow aisles. He shattered the elbow joint of one, causing its sword arm to hang uselessly. He smashed the ankle of the other, toppling it into a shelf. Books, ancient and priceless, cascaded to the floor in a waterfall of crumbling paper and dust. During the chaotic fight, he was forced behind one of the massive reading tables. On its surface, half covered by a fallen tome, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was newer than the other books, perhaps only 50 or 60 years old. As he dodged another clumsy swing, his eyes caught the script. It was in the common tongue. He dispatched the first construct, a final crushing blow from his hammer to the glowing rune on its skull, which shattered with a sound like breaking glass. The armor clattered to the floor, lifeless once more. While the second, crippled guardian struggled to right itself, Alaric snatched the journal. He flipped it open. The handwriting was that of a fellow hunter. Day 47, the entry read. I have reached the library. The tales are lies, all lies. The lord of this castle is no blood-crazed beast. He is a scholar, a prisoner. He seeks a cure for his own damnation, not dominion over the world. I have spoken with him. He is tragic. His guardians are not born of malice, but of a desperate, lonely need for security. I have been a fool. I came to destroy a monster, but I have only found a sad old man. The final construct was upon him. Alaric slammed the journal shut, his mind reeling. He dodged, and with a final desperate surge of strength, he brought his hammer down on the creature's head, silencing it forever. Panting in the dusty silence, he looked at the journal in his hand. A sad old man. A scholar. It couldn't be. The whispers, the legends, the missing livestock that terrified villagers. But then he remembered the troll's words, the sorrowful beauty of the garden, the unused torture chambers he'd glimpsed down a side corridor. Doubt, a venomous seed, was planted in his mind. A sudden violent coughing fit seized him, harder than ever before. He spat a thick glob of blood and gray dust onto the floor. The poison from the werewolf was accelerating his decay. He looked at the journal, then toward the back of the library. He had no time for doubts. He had no time for morality. He had a mission. The previous hunter had mentioned a secret passage. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a section of books dedicated to celestial charts and astronomy. The journal had mentioned something about following the wanderers. He began to rearrange the books, placing them in the order of the planets from the sun. With a low groan, a section of the bookshelf slid sideways, revealing a dark, spiral staircase descending into the cold earth. The truth didn't matter. Only the cure mattered. With his jaw set, Alaric stepped out of the dusty silence and began his descent into the heart of the castle. The spiral staircase descended for what felt like a mile, the air growing colder, heavier, and charged with a palpable sense of sorrow. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, testament to countless journeys made by one solitary being. The descent ended abruptly at a heavy iron-banded door. It was unlocked. Alaric pushed it open and stepped into a long, narrow gallery. There were no paintings on the polished stone walls, no tapestries depicting ancient battles. The gallery was lined with mirrors, dozens of them, in ornate, tarnished silver frames, each one tall and wide enough to reflect a man from head to toe. The only light came from enchanted sconces that burned with a cold blue flame, casting long, distorted shadows. Alaric took a cautious step forward, his reflection moving with him in the nearest mirror. But as he drew closer, the image wavered, and it was no longer his own. His breath caught in his throat. Reflected back at him was the face of a young boy, his eyes wide with terror. A moment before a ghoul's claws had torn him from Alaric's grasp 30 years ago. He saw the miller's wife from Westfall, her face accusing, the one he'd arrived too late to save from a nest of harpies. He saw a dozen faces, 100 faces, all the failures, all the innocents whose deaths lay in some small way at his door. They did not speak, but their silent, sorrowful judgment was a physical weight upon his soul. He tore his gaze away, his heart pounding, and looked at the next mirror. This one was worse. It showed him, but not as he was. It showed him as the gray consumption saw him. His skin was translucent, his organs visible beneath, turning slowly to gray grit. He watched in horror as his own reflection raised a hand, and the flesh flaked away from the bone like dry parchment. His reflection opened its mouth to scream, but only a cloud of fine dust emerged before the entire body collapsed into a pile of ash on the floor. It was a vision of his inevitable, impending death. Stumbling back, he spun toward a third mirror across the hall. This one showed nothing but a freshly dug grave in a lonely, weed-choked cemetery. A simple wooden cross stood at its head. The name carved into it was his own, Alaric. Rain began to fall in the mirror world, turning the soil to mud, slowly, inexorably, washing the name away until the cross was blank. It was a vision of his future, not just death, but utter, meaningless oblivion, to be forgotten. For a man who had built a legend, who was known to the world as Stonefist, this was the ultimate horror. "No," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the gallery. The mirrors were not simple illusions. They were magical artifacts, psychic resonators that fed on fear and regret, reflecting a person's deepest anxieties back at them. They were designed to break the will of any intruder, to drown them in their own despair. A whisper slithered into his mind. a silken, venomous voice that seemed to emanate from all the mirrors at once. "You are a failure hunter, a walking corpse, a forgotten ghost."
"No!"
he roared, the sound exploding from his lungs. He swung his warhammer, the rage giving him a surge of desperate strength. He smashed the first mirror, the one showing the faces of the dead. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, but each tiny shard on the floor still held a fragment of an accusing eye, a grieving mouth. He turned and shattered the second mirror and the third. He rampaged through the gallery, a whirlwind of destruction, breaking frame after frame, trying to destroy the visions that haunted him. But it was useless. The whispers grew louder, the visions more intense, swirling around him in the glittering dust of broken glass. He saw his body decay, heard the laughter of monsters he'd slain, felt the cold finality of his forgotten grave. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, his legendary resolve crumbling. He was dying. He had failed. It was all for nothing. And then, something deep inside him shifted. It was not courage. It was not heroism. It was something far older, far more primal. It was the simple, selfish, desperate will to live. It was the raw, ugly desire to not die, to not become dust, to not be forgotten. It was the same cold fury he'd felt in the healer's hut, now magnified 1,000 times. The goal justifies the means. The old, ruthless creed that had guided him through so many dark places. He focused on that feeling, on the burning core of his own selfish need. He did not want to save the world. He wanted to save himself. He did not want to die a hero. He wanted to live as anything, even a monster. This singular, powerful emotion was an anchor in the storm of despair. It was a truth so profound and so terrible that the illusions of the mirrors could find no purchase on it. They were built to break heroes by preying on their guilt and fear of failure. They had no power over a man who had already embraced his own damnation. He rose to his feet, the whispers fading, the visions receding into the broken glass. He was no longer fighting the gallery. He was ignoring it. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, a whetstone against which he sharpened his resolve. He walked the remaining length of the gallery, his boots crunching on the shattered glass, his eyes fixed forward. He did not look left or right. He just walked, his purpose now as hard and as cold as diamond. At the far end of the hall stood a pair of massive double doors carved from a single piece of polished black obsidian. They seemed to absorb the light, emanating an aura of immense age and power. He could feel a presence on the other side, ancient and weary, like a sleeping mountain. He had passed the final test. He had faced his own soul and accepted the monster within. He placed his hands on the cold obsidian and pushed. The obsidian doors swung open without a sound, revealing the throne room. It was a vast, circular chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were hung with immense faded tapestries that depicted the rise and fall of a civilization so ancient its memory had turned to dust. There were no braziers, no candles. The only light filtered through a colossal stained glass window at the far end of the room, a mosaic of swirling reds and purples that depicted a dying star. And there, standing before the window, his back to the door, was a tall, slender figure in robes the color of a midnight sky. He was looking out at the crimson moon hanging over the spire peaks. It was Lord Vorlag. Alaric entered, his warhammer held at the ready, his senses screaming. The air was thick with power, but it was a quiet, contemplative power, not the seething malice he had expected. The figure turned, and Alaric's breath caught. This was no monster from a nightmare. Vorlag's face was noble, aristocratic, with high cheekbones and intelligent, deep-set eyes. There were no grotesque fangs, no bestial features. His skin was pale, yes, but it was the pallor of a scholar who has not seen the sun in centuries, not the chalky white of the undead. A profound, bone-deep weariness radiated from him, a sorrow that seemed to hang in the very air around him. "So," Vorlag said, his voice not a hiss, but a calm, cultured baritone tinged with melancholy. "Another has come to grant me the gift of oblivion." He gestured tiredly at the empty throne behind him. "Tell me, Hunter, what grand lies did they whisper in your ear to send you all this way?" Alaric, momentarily thrown off balance, fell back on his rehearsed role. "I need no lies, vampire," he spat, the word feeling strangely hollow now. "Your castle bleeds evil. The plague that decimates the valleys, the travelers who vanish on the passes, the beasts that prowl your domain. It all leads back to you." Vorlag listened patiently, a flicker of something, not amusement, but perhaps pity, in his ancient eyes. "The plague is a sickness of the blood, born of tainted wells in the lowlands. I have studied it from afar. It has nothing to do with me. The travelers are taken by the winter cold or by their own foolishness. As for my tenants?" A sad smile touched his lips. "The werewolves you fought are the last descendants of a proud family, cursed by a mad god centuries ago. I offered them sanctuary from a world that would hunt them to extinction. The troll, Grok, was the last of his kind, a gentle soul you have now extinguished. They guarded this place not to keep the world out, but to keep me in, to grant me the solitude I crave." "And the garden?" Alaric challenged. "The living trap that feeds on flesh?" "A failed experiment," Vorlag sighed, turning to gaze back out the window. "An attempt to create self-sustaining life from alchemy and blood magic. A grotesque parody of the creation I have so long been denied. Like all my attempts to defy my nature, it became a thing of horror." He turned back, his gaze piercing. "I have not left this castle in 500 years. I have not tasted human blood in a millennium. I am a scholar, hunter, not a tyrant. I seek to understand my curse, to find a way to end it. Your predecessors came with the same righteous fire in their eyes. Their bones now fertilize my failed garden. Their dying psychic screams power the mirrors in my gallery. They too refuse to listen." Alaric's hand tightened on his hammer. The words rang with a terrible truth. The journal, the troll, the castle itself, it all pointed to this. Vorlag was not the monster, but it didn't matter. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and the telltale rattle began in his chest. His time was running out. "Your words change nothing," Alaric rasped. He charged. Vorlag sighed, a sound of infinite regret. "So be it." He did not draw a weapon. As Alaric's hammer swung, Vorlag simply vanished. He dissolved into a cloud of shadow and reappeared 20 feet away, near the throne. The battle was one of profound imbalance. Vorlag was impossibly fast, a phantom of night and speed. He flowed around the room, never attacking directly, but using shadow magic to disorient and frustrate Alaric. Tendrils of darkness would lash out, trying to ensnare his legs. Patches of the floor would become intangible, nearly sending him tumbling. Alaric, in turn, fought with the grim efficiency of a master craftsman. He relied on his experience, his instincts. He would predict where Vorlag would reappear, hurling a flask of holy water to cut off his path, forcing the vampire to materialize elsewhere. He used his silver-headed axe to carve zones of protection, knowing the ancient creature would not cross the blessed metal. It was a battle of attrition, Vorlag's endless patience against Alaric's dwindling time. Alaric knew he couldn't win this way. He was tiring, his movements growing sluggish. He needed one chance, one opening. Feigning exhaustion, he stumbled, dropping to one knee. Vorlag, seeing his opponent falter, solidified from the shadows directly in front of him, his hand outstretched, perhaps to end the fight with a touch. It was the opening Alaric needed. With his free hand, he threw a small leather pouch at the vampire's feet. It burst open, releasing a cloud of fine, shimmering white powder. It was unicorn horn, ground to a fine dust, a sacred substance, anathema to ancient unholy magic, a treasure he had spent 3 years and a small fortune to acquire. The powder enveloped Vorlag. The vampire didn't scream, but his body seized, his power momentarily short-circuited by the potent holy substance. His eyes widened in genuine shock, not that he had been tricked, but that a mortal would possess such a thing. For a single critical second, the immortal was paralyzed. Alaric surged upward, dropping his hammer and drawing Wolf's Wail. He drove the silver axe with all his remaining strength into Vorlag's chest. The silver axe struck true. The sound was not the wet crunch of flesh and bone, but a high-pitched, crystalline chime, as if striking a massive geode. Vorlag did not cry out in pain. He staggered back, a look of profound, almost academic surprise on his noble features. He looked down at the silver axe head buried in his chest, then back up at Alaric. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a dawning, tragic understanding. "To hunt and kill a unicorn," Vorlag whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "For me? I am not worth such a desecration, Hunter." He fell to his knees, not from the force of the blow, but as if the strings holding him upright had been cut. The ancient body began to fail. Cracks like those in sun-baked clay spread across his pale skin. Gray dust, not unlike Alaric's own affliction, began to flake away from him, dissolving into nothingness before it hit the floor. The 500-year exile was ending. The 1,000-year curse was breaking. He looked up, his form wavering, his eyes holding Alaric's. The power in the room was collapsing inward, the shadows receding, the tapestries crumbling to dust on the walls. "I have done this world no harm," Vorlag breathed, his voice barely a whisper now. "I have lived in this prison of my own making, mourning an eternity I never asked for. So tell me, as my end finally grants me peace, why? For what great cause did you truly come here?" Alaric limped forward until he stood over the dying immortal. The righteous mask he had worn for the world, for the quest, for himself, finally fell away. It was replaced by a grimace not of heroic victory, but of predatory, desperate hunger. "The healers gave me 2 months," Alaric rasped, the words punctuated by a dry, hacking cough that shook his entire frame. "And you know something, Ancient One? I am not ready to die." Comprehension dawned in Vorlag's fading eyes. The surprise gave way to a look of genuine, profound horror, not for himself, but for the world. He understood everything in that instant. The quest, the unicorn horn, the relentless drive. It was never about saving anyone. The ritual, Vorlag exhaled, the last of his form disintegrating. "You fool! What have you?" And then he was gone. All that remained on the cold stone floor was a pile of gray dust, and nestled within it a single object. It was Vorlag's heart. It was not an organ of flesh and blood. It was a crystal, the size of a man's fist, cut with 1,000 intricate facets. It pulsed with a soft internal light, a deep and vibrant crimson, and it beat with a slow, steady rhythm that Alaric could feel in the marrow of his own crumbling bones. It was the source of Vorlag's power, the locus of his immortality, the Crimson Heart. Alaric fell to his knees beside it. He was shaking, not from exhaustion, but from a terrible, ecstatic anticipation. He had imagined this moment for months, played it out in his mind 1,000 times. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the heart. It was warm, humming with a life force that made the very air around it thrum. He drew a small, sharp knife from his belt. There was no ceremony here, no arcane words to be chanted. The grimoire had been clear. The final act was one of pure, primal consumption. This was not a sacrament. It was an act of violation, of theft, of ultimate selfishness. He raised the heart, its crimson light painting his face in demonic shades. He saw his own reflection in its multifaceted surface, a haggard, dying old man, his eyes burning with a terrifying, feverish greed. He opened his mouth. He looked like a starving man offered his first meal in a year. The hero, Stonefist, was dead. Only the hunger remained. Alaric bit into the Crimson Heart. The crystal gave way with a sickening crunch, like biting into a shard of glass and hard candy. An impossibly complex taste flooded his senses, a mixture of cold ash, ancient dust, metallic blood, and a surge of raw, untamed power that was both intoxicating and agonizing. He devoured it ravenously, the sharp fragments cutting his mouth and throat, the crimson light pouring down his gullet like liquid fire. The moment the last piece was swallowed, the transformation began. It was not a gentle healing. It was a violent, brutal rebirth. A scream of inhuman agony was torn from his lungs as a wave of pure power detonated in the core of his being. His bones snapped, audibly breaking under an unseen pressure, only to be instantly fused back together, stronger, denser than before. His muscles tore themselves from their anchor points and were rewoven in seconds with dark, immortal energy. The gray consumption, the disease that had been slowly grinding him to dust, was incinerated in a flash of internal fire. The pain was absolute, a supernova of torment that wiped away all thought, all identity, leaving only a screaming, writhing vessel of change. His cry echoed through the throne room, through the silent halls of Castle Malachor, a birth scream for the monster that was being forged in the crucible of his own ambition. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pain vanished. An unnerving, profound silence fell. Alaric lay twitching on the cold stone floor, steam rising from his body. For a full minute, he did not move. Then slowly, purposefully, he pushed himself up. He was no longer an old man. The stoop in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a straight, powerful posture. The wasted muscles of his limbs were now corded and strong, filled with a restless energy. He looked down at his hands. The liver spots and wrinkled skin were gone. They were pale, flawless, and tipped with nails that had thickened and sharpened into subtle claws. The deep, ragged scar from the werewolf's attack on his forearm had vanished without a trace. He lifted his head and opened his eyes. They were no longer the faded gray of a weary veteran. They now burned with the same crimson glow as the heart he had consumed. The world snapped into a new, terrifying focus. He could see every particle of dust dancing in the faint moonlight. He could hear the frantic, terrified heartbeat of a mouse hiding in the castle wall 100 feet away. He could feel the ancient power of the castle itself, a vast, sleeping web of magic, now stirring and attuning itself to him. He was strong. He was whole. He was eternal. He walked toward the ancient throne, his steps silent and sure. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. to bend and writhe as if in supplication. He was not just an intruder anymore. He had consumed the castle's heart, and in doing so had become its new heart. The stones of Malachor, the beasts that prowled its grounds, the very air within its walls, it all recognized its new master. He settled into the cold obsidian throne. It felt like it was made for him. He leaned back, the dark power of his new body thrumming, a perfect, unending symphony of strength. All the pain, all the fear, all the weakness of his mortal life was gone, burned away in the fire of his transformation. He had won. He had defied death itself. But as he sat there, a new sensation began to dawn within him, growing from a faint ember in his gut to a raging, all-consuming inferno. It was an emptiness, a profound and terrifying void where his mortality used to be. The power he had gained was not free. It demanded payment. It demanded sustenance. Alaric, the hero who had saved himself by damning the world, looked out of the great stained glass window, his new crimson eyes gazing down upon the sleeping lands of Greyfell below. And for the first time, he felt it. A deep, gnawing, and eternal thirst.